What type of government does Ukraine have?
They have a system with a president and a prime minister. So it's a presidential system mainly, but the prime minister has a lot of power too. And what happened was recently, after about 12 weeks of protests, mainly nonviolent, just a little bit of violence at the end, the president was essentially overthrown. He agreed initially to a power sharing agreement and early elections, but then things kind of escalated and he fled, claiming that he feared for his life. And so that's what precipitated the change in government. So now there's a new president, an interim president, and a new prime minister, and they're going to have elections on May 25th, I believe.
Why was President Yanukovych overthrown?
There was a there's a real split in the country of Ukraine. About half the country, or about 60%, are Ukrainians. About 40% are Russian speaking or Russian ethnicity. And the Russians tend to live in the Crimea and in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine closer to Russia. And the Ukrainians live on the European side. And really, for about a decade, there's been a real division about where to go for the country. Should they try to align themselves more with Europe, or should they try to align themselves more with Russia? And the former president, Yanukovych, he signed an agreement. He was basically was negotiating with Russia and with Europe, the EU, and he was negotiating with the EU on a trade agreement, and he was negotiating with Russia on gas and things, and he decided at the last minute to just cut off negotiations with the EU and accept a $15 billion grant, I guess, from the Russians, and decided basically to shift the country more pro-Russia. It was at that point that the demonstrations began. People in the the western side of Ukraine, which includes the capital of Kyiv. When Yanukovych broke off the deal with the EU and went with the Russians, then all of a sudden there were these protests in this square called the Maidan, and thousands of people just camped out. It was kind of like an Occupy type of protest, and they were demanding basically that he go back and negotiate with Europe, the EU, on trade and things. As the protests wore on, and you got to remember, this is protests in December, January, February, in the heart of a Ukrainian winter. I mean, it's cold. These are real determined people. But as the protests continued, they started to bring up corruption issues and the fact that it looked like that Yanukovych and his cronies were getting very wealthy from being in the positions of power that they held. And so it became not just about the direction of the country, but also kind of a referendum on Yanukovych. And by the end, the protesters were really demanding that Yanukovych resign and that they have a different leader, because not just because he was taking them in a different direction, but because he was corrupt. He was corrupt, and in the end, I mean, since Yanukovych left, they've shown this beautiful villa that he built, this kind of a Versailles-like villa, and have found all kinds of money that was taken and things like this. So in that sense, the protesters were right. Yanukovych was somewhat corrupt.
Why is Russia getting involved?
There's a part of Ukraine called the Crimea, which is this peninsula that sticks out into the Black Sea. It's a kind of subtropical, sort of like Florida. It's very nice. It's traditionally been part of Russia. Khrushchev gave it to the Ukraine in 1954 when it was all the Soviet Union and it didn't really matter. Russians have their navy base, their whole Black Sea fleet in the Crimea, and they have agreements with the Ukrainians to have access to those bases and protect them. Russia also feels strongly about protecting the Russian population in those regions. And I think that the Russians are basically, the worry was when Yanukovych fell and the Russians, all of a sudden there are these troops that appear in the Crimea that start surrounding the Ukrainian troops in their bases and taking over the airports and stuff. The fear was that Russia was just going to invade and take this territory and make it part of Russia. And that would be a huge, huge deal. in international politics, since World War II, especially with the UN, we don't take over territory by force. That's just a flat rule in international relations. And it looked like Russia was going to just blatantly violate this. That's why Secretary of State Kerry in the U.S. said that Russia's, policies are more 19th century, kind of colonial policies. You don't just go take over territory. That's a big, big deal. Since the initial military, I guess, occupation of the Crimea, Russia's walked it back a little and they said, oh, those aren't our troops. They're local defense forces. We don't really control them. But everybody knows they're Russian and everybody knows that they do control those troops. And it's become the big crisis is the international community going to let Russia just take over a territory that's a sovereign part of another country? And that's a big, big deal. So that's why it's such an important crisis right now.
What is Russia's next move?
The question is Russia going to then follow up with more troops and actually try to annex the Crimea? Are they going to put troops in eastern and southern Ukraine, where there's also a lot of Russians in those areas too? Are they just doing this for bargaining purposes? What is the goal that Russia has? I think what Russia ideally wanted, they want a Ukrainian government that's pro-Russia. Well, if they let the electoral process work, that might not happen. So perhaps Putin is trying to coerce the Ukrainian people in order to get that to happen. Perhaps he's just bluffing and, will back off as soon as the Ukrainians give in to him and maybe create. Crimea was already an autonomous province, but maybe if they give it some sort of quasi-independent status or something, that might be enough for him. On the other hand, he could just send more troops in. If he sends more troops in, then we're looking at a civil war in Ukraine.
Why should the United States be concerned about this conflict?
It's important for the United States, I would say first and foremost, because of this rule that you don't take over territory by force. Second of all, Russia is a major power, and they play an important role in what we're trying to do in Syria right now with getting the chemical weapons out, and what we're trying to do with Iran by negotiating an end to their nuclear program. And if the Russians turn on the U.S., then those two problem areas, Syria and Iran, get to be more problematic for the U.S. So that's part of it. It's very delicate for the U.S. because, at the one hand, there's I think an emotional and realistic desire to support this norm that we don't take over territory by force. But at the same time, the U.S. does need Russia to play along and to be a normal player in the international community and not to use these kind of methods. The other thing is it's going to affect Europe quite a lot because Russia sends a lot of natural gas to Europe. And if the Europeans put sanctions on Russia and Russia retaliates, then the Europeans don't get much gas, which isn't good at this time of year. You want to heat your homes and stuff, right? It's also, as we might have seen, the Monday after all this happened, financial markets, particularly in Russia, but all over the world, just tanked. And if there's going to be a militarized crisis in that part of the world, if there's going to end up being a civil war in Ukraine, it's going to affect financial markets around the world too.
Do you think the United States will get involved?
No, I think that the U.S. will not get involved militarily because, lots of reasons, but I think that they would recognize that we don't want to have a shooting war between Russian and U.S. troops, right? On the other hand, the U.S. would want to use every diplomatic and economic means in their power to put some costs on Russia because, maybe we can't stop them from just militarily annexing this country, but we want to make it clear that that's not acceptable behavior and it's not going to be tolerated. And even if they take over that territory, we'll wait them out and eventually they'll have to give it back. That's the way we've done it with other countries that have taken over lands, with the one exception being when Iraq took over Kuwait in 1990, because the Soviet Union at that time and the U.S. both of us like mine, they wanted to enforce the norm. You don't take over territory by force. That was a military action to free Kuwait.
Do you think the United States is handling this situation well?
Right now, I think they're handling it reasonably well because there is a recognition that there's not going to be a military response. The U.S. is coming up with $1 billion in loan guarantees in coordination now with the EU that's going to give a $15 billion aid package to Ukraine. And there is negotiation happening as we speak, at least in Paris, between all of the parties involved. So the way this thing gets solved is by talking, not shooting. And right now we're lucky. There hasn't been actual shooting. The Russian troops are in Ukraine, in the Crimea, but they haven't actually shot at anybody. There hasn't been any violence. If violence breaks out, this will very quickly escalate to a civil war, and it'll be very bloody and terrible. Maybe not as bad as Syria, but it could potentially be that bad.
The United States does not want Russia to invade Ukraine, but the U.S. has invaded other countries before. What do you make of that?
Well, that's one of the problems that the U.S. faces right now is they're making this argument that you don't just invade another country on some flimsy pretext, but yet the U.S. has the problem that they invaded Iraq in 2003 on a pretext that didn't seem to work out. The difference would be the U.S. never had any intention of actually taking over Iraq or taking over that territory, whereas it looks like the Russians, in this case, actually might want to take over territory and annex it. And that's a huge... The fact that that norm exists is one of the reasons why we haven't had a lot of war since World War II. It's one of the reasons why we've gotten very good as an international community at eliminating international wars. Most of our wars are civil wars these days.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
This is the biggest crisis in the post-Cold War era, I think. It really scared me when I saw those Russian troops because I was worried that there were more coming. And if we can diffuse this crisis, it would be a very good thing. It may be that it takes a long time, but it's important that countries can't just take over territory and get away with it. That's a really important norm. It keeps the world a lot safer.